What would you do if the person who shattered your life was considered untouchable? Not because the evidence was missing, not because witnesses were hard to find, but because his father held the keys to the entire town's justice system. This is the harrowing reality faced by Marcus Cole, a 43-year-old Army veteran who carried the weight of 3 combat tours overseas and the physical shrapnel of a Purple Heart still embedded in his leg. Marcus survived the roadside bombs of Fallujah and the lethal ambushes of Kandahar, things most people can only see in their worst nightmares. He fought for a flag that promised him protection, only to find that in his own hometown of Ridgemont, Virginia, that flag was being used to drape the shoulders of a coward. Marcus Cole wasn't looking for a fight on that Saturday night in October. Since returning to civilian life in 2019, he had found solace in silence, working at the local hardware store and volunteering at the VFW Hall. He lived by a code of honor that didn't require an audience. But Ridgemont was a town built on a different kind of code, one dictated by the Holloway family. Richard Holloway had been the police chief for 14 years, a man who believed the badge was a family crest rather than a public trust. And his son, 24-year-old Brett Holloway, was the crown prince of this small-town dynasty. Brett Holloway had never faced a consequence in his entire life. He drove a brand new pickup truck like he owned the asphalt beneath it, and walked into every room expecting the world to bow. To Brett, laws were mere suggestions for the little people, and his father's position was a permanent shield against the reality of his own actions. On the night of October 14th, when Brett walked into Shelby's Tavern, he wasn't just looking for a drink, he was looking for a target to prove his dominance. He didn't know that his arrogance was about to collide with a man who had stared down real monsters, and he certainly didn't know that his father's untouchable status was about to expire in the courtroom of the one person who cannot be bought, Judge Simpson. On the night of October 14th, 2022, Marcus Cole walked into Shelby's Tavern on the east side of Ridgemont just to watch the game with a few buddies from the VFW. He ordered a ginger ale because he had been sober for 3 years, a hard-won victory he guarded more fiercely than his military medals. He sat in a corner booth, a quiet man who bothered absolutely nobody. Around 10:30, Brett Holloway surged through the door with 4 friends, trailing the scent of expensive bourbon and cheap entitlement. Brett was loud, bumping into patrons and laughing as he knocked a waitress's tray out of her hands. Standard behavior for a boy who viewed his father's badge as a license to be a menace. The group moved toward the back, and as Brett brushed past Marcus's table, he carelessly knocked the veteran's drink onto the floor. Marcus spoke up, politely, as witnesses later confirmed. He simply said, "Hey, watch where you're going." But in Brett Holloway's world, being corrected by a hardware store clerk was an unforgivable insult. He got in Marcus's face, sneering the words that had silenced every other voice in town. "You don't talk to me like that. Do you know who my father is?" Marcus, a man who had seen enough violence to last 10 lifetimes, simply stood up, told Brett he didn't want any trouble, and walked toward the exit. He never made it to his truck. Brett followed him into the gravel parking lot behind the tavern, where a single halogen light cast long, flickering shadows. Without a word of warning, Brett Holloway punched Marcus Cole in the back of the head, a coward's strike. When Marcus turned, Brett hit him again and again, and when the veteran fell, the police chief's son began kicking him in the ribs. The assault lasted maybe 45 seconds, but 45 seconds is an eternity when your fractured orbital bone is grinding into the gravel while your attacker laughs. Marcus ended up in the emergency room with 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, and a gash requiring 11 stitches. The doctor documented every injury, and Marcus filed a police report the next morning. Then something remarkable happened, absolutely nothing. No arrest, no investigation, and the security footage from the bar accidentally vanished, all because in Ridgemont the law didn't apply to the Holloway name. The silence in Ridgemont was louder than the punches thrown in that gravel parking lot. For Marcus Cole, the weeks following the assault were a masterclass in systemic betrayal. Every time he limped into the Ridgemont Police Department, the air turned cold. The officers he had once greeted with respect now looked through him as if he were a ghost. His phone calls to the district attorney went unreturned, and his written inquiries were buried under a mountain of investigative procedures. It was a wall of silence built by Chief Richard Holloway, designed to protect his son by making the victim simply disappear into the cracks of the system. Marcus sat in his small apartment night after night, with his service dog, Duke, resting a heavy head on his lap. The physical pain from his cracked ribs was nothing compared to the psychological wound of being discarded by the country he had bled for. He thought about the promises made in the heat of Kandahar that no man is left behind. Yet here he was in the heart of Virginia, being left behind by the very people who wore the same flag on their shoulders. Even his own local attorney, a man who had known Marcus's mother for decades, leaned across a mahogany desk and whispered the most devastating words Marcus had ever heard. "Drop it, Marcus. You can't win this. In this town, the Holloways are the law. Don't make things worse for yourself." But they didn't understand the man they were trying to silence. Marcus Cole had spent years in places where quitting meant dying. He had stared down death in Fallujah. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a small-town bully in a tailored suit. The betrayal didn't break his spirit. It ignited a cold, hard determination. He knew he couldn't get a criminal trial in a town where the judge played golf with the perpetrator's father. He needed a different kind of battlefield. He needed a place where the Holloway name meant nothing, and where the truth was the only currency that mattered. Through a connection at the VFW, Marcus learned about a venue that the Ridgemont elite couldn't control, the televised courtroom of Judge Simpson. It wasn't just a civil court, it was a platform where the world would watch. Marcus didn't want money, he wanted the truth to be heard where it couldn't be erased. He submitted his case detailing the medical records, the intimidated witnesses, and the blatant cover-up. When the call came that they wanted to hear his story, Marcus knew this was his last stand. He was walking into a lion's den, but he was bringing the one thing the Holloways feared most, the unvarnished, undeniable truth. Brett Holloway agreed to show up, thinking it was a joke, a chance to show off his charisma on national TV. He had no idea he was walking into the crosshairs of a judge who had spent a lifetime stripping the masks off cowards like him. 6 weeks after Marcus Cole decided he would no longer be a silent victim, the studio lights of the Los Angeles courtroom hummed to life, signaling a new chapter in his grueling quest for accountability. This was no longer the dim, threatening hallways of the Ridgemont Police Department, where shadows whispered warnings. This was a stage where the truth would be broadcast to an entire nation. For Marcus, this was his final battlefield, the place where he would defend the very honor he had paid for with his own blood and bone in the sands of foreign lands. Marcus Cole entered the room with a haunting, quiet composure. He didn't wear a designer suit to project power. He wore a simple, crisp button-down shirt, and pinned prominently above his heart was his Purple Heart medal, a physical manifestation of sacrifice that required no explanation. Beside him, his service dog, Duke, walked with a stoic loyalty, as if the animal itself understood the gravity of the moment. Marcus radiated a silent dignity, a spiritual weight that stood in stark, chilling contrast to the energy erupting from the other side of the room. The Holloway family arrived not as defendants, but as if they were attending the red carpet premiere of their own glory. Brett Holloway was draped in a custom-tailored suit, his hair slicked back with an expensive sheen, a smirk still dancing on his lips, that same smirk he believed was a universal skeleton key to any lock. He glanced around the courtroom with an amused glint in his eyes, occasionally leaning in to whisper a joke to his mother, Diane, who beamed back at him with an enabling pride. Standing behind them like a monument of institutional power was Chief Richard Holloway. Even without his uniform, he carried the suffocating aura of a man who had ruled a town for 14 years. His gaze toward Marcus wasn't one of remorse, but of a quiet, predatory threat, as if to say, "You've stepped out of line, soldier, and there will be a price." They came here with the ironclad belief that the Holloway name was a shield that could never crack. The whispers and the smug posturing were instantly decapitated by the thunderous crack of the bailiff's gavel. "All rise. Judge Simpson presiding. As the heavy oak doors swung open, Judge Simpson swept into the room in her black robes, a figure of absolute narrative authority. She didn't look at the cameras and she didn't acknowledge the gallery. She looked only at the case file on her bench, then flicked her eyes, sharp as a scalpel, toward Brett Holloway. Judge Simpson was a woman who had spent a lifetime stripping the masks off liars, and she was not impressed by expensive silk or family titles. As she sat down and removed her glasses, the air in the room seemed to freeze. She looked at the medical reports, the fractured orbital bone, the cracked ribs, the map of trauma on Marcus's body, then looked directly into Brett's eyes. In that precise second, the smirk on Brett Holloway's face began to wither. He felt a sudden icy jolt of reality as he realized that this was not a judge who played golf with his father. She began in a low, resonant voice that carried the weight of an approaching storm. "We are here today to find the truth, and the truth has no interest in who your father is." Marcus Cole knew then, for the first time in months, that he had finally found someone willing to stand for the law. The real war had just begun. Judge Simpson did not begin with a lecture. She began with a surgical strike. She looked at Brett Holloway, whose expensive suit now seemed to be wearing him rather than the other way around. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, terrifying calm, "I have read your statement. You claim this was mutual combat. You claim that Marcus Cole, a man with shrapnel in his leg and a service dog at his side, was the aggressor. Is that your testimony today, under oath, in front of this nation?" Brett swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward his father in the gallery. Chief Holloway sat like a statue, his face a mask of stone, but his knuckles were white as they gripped the wooden bench. Brett cleared his throat, trying to summon the cocky grin that had served him so well in Ridgemont. "Your Honor," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "He was being disrespectful in the bar. He told me to watch it. I felt threatened. Out in the parking lot, things just got heated. It was a fair fight, two guys settling a dispute. He's a soldier, right? I figured he could handle himself." The silence that followed was suffocating. Judge Simpson leaned forward, her eyes narrowing until they were like two shards of flint. "A fair fight," she repeated, the words dripping with a sarcasm that cut through the air. "You call striking a man from behind while he is walking toward his vehicle a fair fight? You call kicking a man in the ribs while he lies face down in the gravel mutual combat?" Brett stammered. "Well, the shadows were dark, and I thought—" Judge Simpson cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "Stop talking. Every word you say is an insult to the intelligence of this court and a desecration of the uniform your father wears." She then turned her attention to Marcus Cole. "Mr. Cole," she said, her tone shifting from ice to tempered steel, respectful yet firm. "In your years of service, how many times were you taught to strike a man from behind who was retreating?" Marcus looked her in the eye, his voice steady. "Never, Your Honor. That's not how we're trained. That's not what honor looks like." Judge Simpson nodded slowly. She then looked back at the Holloways, her gaze lingering on the chief. "It seems," she said, "that in Ridgemont, justice is a family business. But this courtroom is not a franchise. We don't care about your bloodline. We care about the law. And right now, the law is looking at a coward who hid behind his father's badge to break a man's face." The smirk was gone. For the first time in 24 years, Brett Holloway realized that his father's shadow wasn't long enough to cover him in this room. The tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point as Judge Simpson looked back at the case file. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice dropping into a register of sharp clinical precision, "you seem very confident in your version of mutual combat. You seem certain that your father's officers did a thorough job when they reported that the security cameras at Shelby's Tavern were malfunctioning during a system update on the night of October 14th. Isn't that convenient?" Brett Holloway adjusted his tie, a flash of his old arrogance flickering across his face. "Technology is unreliable, Your Honor. The bar owner told the police it was a glitch. It happens." Chief Holloway, sitting in the gallery, gave a barely perceptible nod, a silent affirmation of the cover-up he had orchestrated. He believed he had scrubbed the slate clean. He believed that in a town like Ridgemont, a missing tape was as good as an acquittal. But Judge Simpson leaned back, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. The kind of smile a hunter wears when the prey walks into the trap. You're right, Mr. Holloway. Technology is often unreliable. But greed is very predictable. She reached for a remote on her bench. The bar owner did indeed erase the main server footage to satisfy your father's department. But what he didn't realize, or perhaps what he forgot, is that his insurance company requires a secondary, encrypted off-site backup for liability reasons. And while the local police couldn't find it, my legal team has a way of locating things that people want to stay buried. The courtroom went deathly silent. Brett's face drained of color. Chief Holloway stood up instinctively, his mouth opening as if to protest, but the bailiff's hand was already on his shoulder, forcing him back into his seat. Judge Simpson pressed a button, and the large monitors in the room flickered to life. The footage wasn't blurry. It was high definition, crystal clear, and devastating. The video showed Marcus Cole walking toward his truck, his head down, his gait steady and non-threatening. Then the camera caught Brett Holloway and his friends bursting through the exit. The footage showed Brett running, not walking, but sprinting toward Marcus's back. It showed the first sucker punch that sent the veteran's head snapping forward. It showed Marcus hitting the gravel, and then it showed the most harrowing part. Brett Holloway laughing as he delivered a series of brutal kicks to the ribs of a man who was already unconscious. There was no mutual combat. There was no provocation. There was only a predator and his prey. The studio audience gasped in unison, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a physical blow. Judge Simpson let the footage play until the very end, until it showed Brett Holloway spitting on the ground next to Marcus's motionless body, before walking back into the bar with a triumphant stride. She turned the screen off and looked at Brett. Now, she whispered, her voice vibrating with a righteous fury that shook the room. Would you like to tell me again about your fair fight? The heavy silence that followed the security footage was not just the silence of shock. It was the silence of a legacy crumbling in real time. Judge Simpson turned her chair slowly, her eyes moving away from the pale, trembling Brett Holloway and landing directly on Chief Richard Holloway in the gallery. The air in the room grew thin, charged with a righteous static. She didn't raise her voice, but every word she spoke felt like a gavel strike against the soul of the town of Ridgemont. Chief Holloway, she began, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. You have worn that badge for 14 years. You have taken an oath to protect the weak and uphold the law without favor or affection. But tonight, I see a man who has used his authority, not as a shield for the innocent, but as a shovel to bury the truth. She stood up, her black robes billowing like a dark cloud. You didn't just fail Marcus Cole. You failed every single officer who serves with honor. You turned a police department into a private security firm for your son's brutality. You watched that footage. I can see it in your eyes. And yet you allowed your officers to intimidate witnesses and erase evidence. That is not leadership. That is a betrayal of the highest order. Richard Holloway tried to maintain his composure, his jaw locked tight, but the mask was cracking. His wife, Diane, was no longer smirking. She was sobbing into her hands, the weight of the national spotlight finally crushing the walls of their small-town fortress. Judge Simpson then turned back to Marcus Cole, who stood at his podium with the same stoic dignity he had maintained since the beginning. Mr. Cole, she said, her voice softening with a profound respect. You survived ambushes in Kandahar only to be ambushed in your own backyard by a boy who thought his father's name was a license to kill. You sought justice, and you were met with a wall of silence. But that wall ends here. She looked back at Brett, her eyes flashing with a final lethal clarity. You thought you were untouchable because you were the chief's son. You thought Marcus was just a hardware store clerk you could kick into the dirt. But look at him. He is a giant, and you are a shadow. You are not a tough guy. Tough guys don't run at a man's back. You are a coward who has been coddled into believing you are a king. Well, your reign is over. She reached for her gavel, her hand steady and purposeful. I am awarding Marcus Cole the maximum settlement for medical expenses, lost wages, and pain and suffering. But I am doing something else. I am forwarding this footage and a full transcript of these proceedings to the State Attorney General's office for a criminal investigation into obstruction of justice and aggravated assault. In this courtroom, the badge is a promise, and tonight we are going to make sure that promise is kept. The final crack of Judge Simpson's gavel didn't just end a trial. It shattered the glass ceiling of corruption that had suffocated Ridgemont for over a decade. As the courtroom cleared, the silence that remained was different. It was the peaceful, heavy silence of a debt finally paid. Brett Holloway was led out of the room, his head bowed, the designer suit now looking like a shroud for his expired ego. His father, the once invincible Richard Holloway, walked out behind him, avoiding every camera lens, a man who had entered as a king and left as a cautionary tale. But the real story didn't end with the ruling. In the weeks that followed, the Simpson effect rippled through the state of Virginia. 11 days after the episode aired, Richard Holloway submitted a one-paragraph resignation. He didn't make excuses. He simply admitted that he had allowed personal loyalty to override professional duty. The wall of silence he had built was torn down by a state-level investigation that eventually led to the resignation of 3 other officers and an overhaul of the Ridgemont justice system. For the townspeople, it was as if they could breathe again. The badge was no longer a family crest. It was being restored to its rightful place as a promise of protection for everyone, regardless of their last name. Marcus Cole walked out of that Los Angeles studio into the bright sunlight, Duke at his side. He didn't feel a sense of vengeful joy. He felt a quiet, profound vindication. He had gone to that court not to destroy a family, but to save the truth. He used the settlement money to do something that would ensure no other veteran would ever feel as invisible as he did. He founded Shield Line, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal advocacy for veterans facing obstacles in local legal systems. To date, Shield Line has assisted over 300 veterans in 12 states, turning Marcus's personal pain into a collective shield for those who served. When asked in a final interview if he felt he had won, Marcus looked at the Purple Heart pinned to his shirt and then at the horizon. "I didn't win," he said softly. "The truth won. I just gave it a voice. Judge Simpson gave it a platform. In the end, that's all any soldier wants, a fair fight and a system that remembers the people it was built to protect." As you watch this, remember Marcus Cole. Remember that even when the system feels rigged and the powerful seem untouchable, honor is a fire that cannot be extinguished. If you believe that accountability matters and that our veterans deserve better, hit that subscribe button. We bring you stories of courage and justice every single week. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay honorable, and never stop standing for the truth.